Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm going to be doing another early kind of preview and showcase guide analysis for what you need to prepare for and how good or how bad this new Albedo character is going to be. She's arguably the most controversial character of all the collaboration heroes that have been announced and showcased thus far. I've done a lot of the math, I've done some research, and I've been doing a bit of deep diving into theory crafting and trying to figure out when exactly you can actually use this character, what she might be good for, and everything in between. Let's get into it. So first things first, we have her skill 3, and Albedo's skill 3 reads that it has a 100% chance to dispel all debuffs, all buffs from the target, while also unbuffabling and decreasing their defense by 2 turns. Now, if this feels kind of similar or sounds like another character you might be thinking of, the answer is yes. This is literally what Abigail's S3 kind of in a nutshell does, outside of a few minor tweaks. With Albedo's S3 and seeing how it may be similar to someone like Abigail's S3, you would maybe imagine that the damage is significant, but we'll kind of get to that later and why I actually think there's a couple issues with Albedo's kit in general. Albedo's skill 2 reads that when an ally suffers a critical hit, it decreases damage suffered by 15%, which is really nice because for this specific part of her kit, it applies to herself. So in general, she reduces 15% of all critical damage dealt to herself. However, for the second part of her kit, it reads that when an ally, except for the caster, suffers a critical hit, she also counterattacks with Let's Go Bacorn. And it's a 2-turn cooldown, essentially horse, kind of semi-decent nuke, which at first we weren't entirely sure how good it would be, but after the data mines and after we've kind of seen what she does in game, you'll see why I'm kind of saying it's not really a nuke. Let's Go Bacorn, however, also dispels 1 buff from the enemy, while also increasing the speed of the caster for 2 turns, and the damage of this scales off of her HP, which of course just makes sense. And now finally, the most simplistic part of her kit is her skill 1, that increases the combat readiness of herself, I believe by either 15 or 20%, I think it's 20%, and the damage that you deal is kind of increased based on how much health you have. But the thing you're probably actually concerned about is, well, how much damage does she do then? Okay, so as you can see here, I have one of these stat lines that I've kind of hypothesized for my Albedo build to see just how much damage she'll do, both on her skill 3 and on her skill 2, and I'm going to be testing it against a couple different targets to see whether or not her S3 is a bit of a nuke that you can use against someone like a Cannaaaa, or I don't know, maybe someone that's tankier. But also I think it's kind of worth looking into whether or not Let's Go Bacorn can also do a lot of damage, so I am going to be testing it against a squishier team that includes cleave characters like Ludwig, Ran, etc, etc. Now if you just take a look at exactly how much damage the skill 3 does here, especially against a 1500 damage target, 8.6 thousand damage is nothing to scoff at. However, it isn't the most insane damage dealing ability ever. This isn't like a Cannaaaa, S3ing. This is not, some insane nuke from a Lone Crescent Bellona, but that makes sense because she's a knight. So even though you can maybe excuse that her S3 damage is not the most insane, especially when it's against a target that has 1500 defense, you could easily argue that she's not supposed to be a super nuke heavy S3 target and that her S3 is supposed to be to strip, unbuffable, and death break. But then I got to thinking, well, what if I were to, I don't know, try to hit someone like Ludwig? So based on the damage that I'm seeing from Ludwig, as you can see here, he has 950 defense, and Albedo's skill 2 only does 3.7 thousand damage, assuming that you crit and you have, again, 27.7 thousand HP and 264 crit damage. And now you may be thinking to yourself, Connor, well, what about her artifact proc? That has to be super high, right? And well, while you might be kind of correct in a sense that 6,000 damage towards a Ludwig is kind of significant, my excitement for the skill dampened the second that I realized that her S2 Let's Go Bacorn has a 2-turn cooldown. So while it does do 6,070 damage in this specific scenario, that's under the assumption that you built a Destruction Albedo with 27.7k HP, 265 crit damage, and also have a 3F that's max and actually activated, all while doing only about 70 to maybe 80% of a Ludwig's health. Now, to be clear, I will be going a bit more in depth about the different playstyles when it comes to the character, but something that I do think is worth mentioning is that even if you were to take a look again at the damage that 3F does against a 1500 damage target, it's only about 10.4k, and although 10.4k is pretty decent, that means that you're giving up something like Holy Sack potentially, Aureus, Adamant, whatever you would have in between. And that does mean that unlike being something like a Carmen or a specific knight like FCC, what you're actually pivoting into is much more of a specific damage dealing knight akin to someone like Last Rider Crow, who we have seen in the past run something like Portrait, but has since then kind of shifted to things like Aureus and the Bastion of Perlucia. What does this all mean? Well, in all honesty, guys, the issue that I find with this character then is that she has a bit of an identity crisis, because you do want the Aureus in case if you're taking a lot of damage and you want to be able to, you know, protect your DPS like a character like Cannaaaa, etc. But then also you sometimes want to deal damage to some things like cleave or squish your targets, and in that case what you actually want is 3F. So you're kind of torn between wanting 3F and Aureus, and we'll talk about Artifact Conundrum later, but just to start off this guide, this character is very confused, and despite me having a couple different variations, even if we were to kind of lower the defense, or let's say even run something like 950 defense on my Ludwig, but have something like 30,000 HP and around 300 crit damage, which I don't think a lot of people are going to have, Let's Go Bacorn ends up only doing 7,000 damage, which is still not enough to one-shot my Ludwig all in one go. As a parting note to this section, something that I do want to mention is that a lot of you guys will be saying, well, what if I use an Elbrus character alongside Let's Go Bacorn? Surely that should be enough and kind of punish anyone that wants to cleave, right? But you would kind of be wrong, because part of the reason why a character like Cannaaaa right now is so popular is because a lot of people will pick someone like Cannaaaa into Abyssal Euphine, and you are specifically rewarded when you take a lot of damage and your team takes a lot of damage, so that you can then hit back, activate his passive, and proc against the team and just one-shot him. And long story short, it just feels like there's a lot of things that can hold back Albedo, the draft, the different playstyles, etc. And it just feels weird that instead of being really good at something like mitigating, aka with FCC and Carmen, she's kind of a jack of all trades, but not in a good way. She's kind of missing a few things that it feels like would make her really, really good. And that's kind of concerning for me. Now, as I mentioned before, and as you can see through kind of the gameplay of the background and what the goal of this character is, she's supposed to punish people for essentially attacking your allies, but depending on whether or not you're on Aureus or if you're on 3F, the damage or the results can kind of vary in how good they are. Now, in terms of what it looks like she wants to do in terms of her kit, it looks like she wants to defense break and unbuffable a character, as you can see here, and do a load of damage. But then at the same time, you also want to mitigate. So whether or not you're actually a good knight, or whether or not you're a good mitigation tool or utility character, is completely up for grabs. Now, although you can argue that a character like Last Rider Crow can be played damage and still have mitigation utility, in the sense that if you AoE against Last Rider Crow, you do provide a barrier to the team, the 15% damage mitigation that you get from Albedo is situational to only specifically crit. And furthermore, again, it's not as though you can continue horsing or stripping buffs with her S2. It's once every 2 turns. So the only thing that I've kind of understood when it comes to her kit, or how you should be trying to play her, is that you want to use her as both a mitigator and also somewhat of a damage dealer, but you kind of have to fight with yourself for whether you want to use Aureus or 3F to either be more damage oriented or support oriented. Now, if we move back a second, as you can see here, we should talk about Imprints, because this isn't a free character that we get, unlike Ainz. So as you can see here, we have 14.4 spread effect resistance, which is really nice. This is kind of similar to what a character like Fallen Cecilia has, and also similar to what Crimson Armin has as well. But the 18% HP, of course, is going to be the thing that you fixate on, because not only does the health allow her to survive, but it also scales in terms of her damage. Now, if you look at her base stats as well, she has 6.8k HP, decently high defense with 700, but the thing you're probably going to fixate on is getting enough HP so that, again, you can run something like 30,000 HP and 300 crit damage if you're trying to counter cleave. Otherwise, what you're probably looking for is a hybrid, and you're going to need the HP imprints to kind of get to that point. So if I were to assess whether or not you need the HP imprints or the effect resistance imprints, the answer is probably no. But if you are someone that's kind of min-maxing and trying to get as much stat as possible, the answer, of course, is going to be yes. That being said, though, however, keep in mind that getting triple S on a limited character is really difficult, and this is unlike trying to get something like an RGB to max triple S. This is a completely limited one-time-a-year collaboration, and if you are trying to get triple S of her, well, just know it's going to cost you a lot, and you can't get it off of the Covenant banner or anything else. Okay, but now it's time to talk about builds and what you could potentially see when it comes to this Albedo character. So I, of course, am trying to show you the different builds. Specifically, this one is on my Fallen Cecilia, who also shares stats with Albedo, and as you can see, I have 27.7k HP, I have 1600 defense, and I have 264 crit damage. I wanted immunity just, I don't know, just in case if for whatever. Okay, maybe you could get rid of this and maybe add a little bit more stat, like maybe HP set. But the long story short of this is that although I am about 147 speed, which I'm hoping to kind of mitigate the speed difference with her speed buff that she gets on S2, she does still have about 28,000 HP. I have triple S Fallen Cecilia, and I also have 264 crit damage. That is kind of murkied by the fact that I have 88 crit chance. But as you saw on the calculator, this build was not really enough to kind of do enough damage. But this is going to be the build that I'm going to be testing when I have 3F on her and I'm trying to use her as a damage dealer. But in case you weren't really subscribed to the damage Albedo build, something that I also was thinking about was just using her as someone that can dispel on S2 and also Death Break on S3. Now, again, you aren't going to be death breaking characters with effect resistance, unfortunately, but in case if you were trying to use someone like Albedo with enough tankiness so that she doesn't die, and so that you can kind of get more turns off and kind of lower the cooldown on her Let's Go Bacorn. As you can see here, I have a build that's also at around 27k HP, but I have her at around 100 effect resistance so that I can activate her S2 and get the dispel on occasion when I need to. Otherwise, though, in terms of actual value, I just wanted someone with enough HP and enough ER and enough turn-taking potential with having 200 speed that she didn't just get lapped. It didn't feel like she was getting controlled. Cool. Now, again, between the two builds, whether or not you choose to be even slower on Destro or if you try to be even more tanky on one of these builds, you kind of have to take into consideration the speed and what you're actually trying to do with your Albedo. This isn't a character that you can kind of just slap gear on. You need purpose when you're building them. So mix and match and find what kind of build you want. These are just the ones that I'm going to be testing. They by no means look super great or swell, but it's going to be the ones that I test. And they look like maybe they could have some potential. We'll find out when she gets released. Now, based off of that last section, you may be wondering what's worthwhile in terms of sets. And the honest truth is that I can kind of see one of 3 different builds kind of working for her. Now, of course, you have the speed set build, which I have right here. And it does look like, again, you gain decent value out of being fast because, again, you want more turns. You want to be able to use Bacorn. However, I can definitely see the value in running something like Destruction because ultimately, again, you want a little bit of damage. You want to kind of have some oomph behind your hit if you are playing the counter cleave variation. But, of course, you do also have access to something like the counter should you want to try and, I guess, I don't know, use S1 and proc off of it. However, in terms of value, there are a lot of people that will likely just ignore the Albedo and hit someone else, which makes it a little bit annoying. And she doesn't have something like a provoke or anything like that on her S1. So unless if you're literally getting one shot by the S1 from your Albedo, which likely you aren't because, you know, you need Destro set to do really big damage or you need counter set to do really big damage, but you also have to get the counter off. You see what the conundrum is here? It feels a little bit weird, but long story short, I would say that her best sets are definitely speed or destruction set. And in terms of trailing, I think that counter could also be good, but you need a lot of gear and investment to make that build work. Now, unlike what you just saw in my Fallen Cecilia, I don't have her artifact, so I put in sunglasses to kind of replace it. But in terms of what you're actually going to be using when it comes to Albedo's artifact, it really kind of feels like she has 2, maybe even 3 artifacts that she can make use of. The first one, of course, is going to be her own, which is not currently here. The second is going to be Aureus if you're trying to use her as more of a mitigator. And the third that I think maybe you could find some value from, but I don't quite know how good it'll be, is something like the Holy Sacrifice tied with Elbrus, because all these knights can kind of make use of reviving and having mitigation, things of this nature. However, again, like I mentioned earlier, you aren't providing the same level of threat with something like Elbrus or Holy Sac as opposed to when they are on someone like Euphine or a Candy. So it is going to be a bit of a toss-up for what her actual best artifact is, but I think that the 2 that you can definitely bank on being tested are going to be Aureus and her own artifact 3F. Now, once again, you might be asking yourself, is she going to be good for PvP? Is she going to be good for PvE? And unfortunately, on the PvE side, it doesn't really feel like she has that good of a spot right now or a position to be used. She doesn't really provide any value in terms of giving buffs to your team, so you don't really have a good reason to use her in something like Banshee. And although she does have a skill tree that defense breaks, using Albedo or any collaboration character specifically just for a hunt outside of literally Rem feels a little bit cope and is definitely not the reason that I would pull for a character. However, in terms of PvP, I could maybe imagine people running something like Holy Sack on their Albedo so that they can bait someone like Ed or Cannaaaa into their Albedo during Guild War attacks or arena attacks. But outside of that, I feel like Albedo, if I had to rate her on a scale of 10 for PvP, is likely going to be on the 5 to 6 end, definitely kind of on the lower end of things, because it feels like, again, she has an identity crisis. However, if you are going to try and use her in slower games, keep in mind that if you are picking her into someone like Lionheart Sirmia, Albedo's S2 Bakorn does activate Lionheart Sirmia, so it's a bit of a kind of weird thing, and it also does proc Rowana, so keep that in mind when you're trying to figure out how you're going to use her, but just be careful because, of course, my original opinion and a lot of my thoughts right now are kind of running through the eyes of a cleaver, and for me, it doesn't feel like her threat as a PvP character is really present as a cleaver. Now, as we talk about synergies, something worth noting is that if Smilegate themselves is going to showcase a kind of video of her specifically being used against a lot of meta characters, to be fair, in the form of Gala and Abyssal Euphine, you would imagine that they have something cooked up for the team composition that they supposedly demoed or is ideal for her to be played in. But look at the team that they showcased her with. It's Conqueror Lilius, Mediator Cowrick, a Crow, and then herself. If you actually want to analyze the team that you see right there, this is a team that essentially has no damage whatsoever outside of, again, Albedo. And in that sense, you would then imagine, oh, well, Albedo could potentially be really good as a solo DPS alongside a utility damage dealer with his horse in the form of Crow. Or even when you take a look at how much damage she does with Let's Go Bakorn, take a look at this. She has Vigor buff, and she ended up only doing 1,175 damage there. Now, again, I'm not trying to put words into the mouths of Smilegate or what they're trying to do here, but if you're trying to showcase her not only missing, but her with Vigor buff doing 1,175 damage to arguably the most insane damage dealer in the game in the form of Abyssal Euphine, come on, Smilegate, what are we doing here? But if we backpedal for a little bit, I do want to talk about the synergies that actually make sense for her, because it's likely that if you are going to be playing Albedo, you aren't going to be doing what they're doing in this showcase and pairing her or trying to show her as the main damage dealer. You're likely going to be using her in the Crimson Armin or kind of as a night slot, and then pair her with another DPS and a utility opener like a Conqueror Lilius. Right now, a lot of people are very hot on ML Politis and how good she is, so I could imagine that characters like ML Politis, Spectre Tenebria would likely do very well for her because, again, you set up the Spectre Tenebria for a defense break with your S3. You could also argue that, of course, pairing her with someone like Navy Captain Landy is going to be very effective because, well, Navy Captain Landy is absolutely bonkers, but in terms of true synergies, it doesn't feel like she does something super well. Arguably, you could pair her with someone like Death Dealer Ray because, you know, you get off all the debuffs and such. However, in terms of actual value and who people are going to pair with her, it's likely that she's going to be used in the night slot, so basically see her get picked alongside every character in the game because that's what they do with characters like Carmen or Arrowell. Now, in terms of a guide, it wouldn't be fair to talk about her synergies without her counters, and you're looking at pretty much one of her biggest ones. Unfortunately, although Urban Shadow Shu could pair very nicely alongside someone like Albedo, it is kind of a threat because she's faster, she can injure and kind of make your team's life hell. And while Albedo can definitely serve as an Aureus, if you are trying to run her on the 3F damage variation, you're gonna literally do no damage just because, again, Urban Shadow Shu does injuries. And to that extent, although I called him a synergy, if you do end up pairing someone like Death Dealer Ray against the Albedo, you can kind of kiss any chance of doing counters or really mitigating anything or doing damage with your S3, just because there are a plethora of characters that already do injuries and kind of reduce your total HP pool, which in Albedo's case not only serves as her health to survive, but also her health to do damage. I do want to also make a special note that based on what we had seen earlier with Ludwig and all the cleave analysis that I had done, that it does feel like she's going to be particularly weak, especially against cleavers and Ran and Ludwig and stuff like that. I do want to acknowledge that there may be some situations where just having Bakorn and an Abyssal Euphine or an Elbrus will kind of make you explode as a cleaver. And in those cases, if that happens, by all means, I'm not saying that Albedo cannot one-shot cleave. It's just that for cleavers right now, if you aren't drafting a way to deal with the landmines or deal with the characters that basically one-shot you, you're not really cleaving, you're picking characters to then just get instantly one-shot. So that's kind of my perspective for why I don't think she's going to be super good for cleave, because I think cleavers, especially right now, are just going to counter or prevent you from actually one-shotting. Now, as we return back to Albedo stats, you're probably wondering, of course, is she worth pulling? Is she a must pull? But before any of that, with the scarcity of collabs nowadays in the EpicSeven kind of landscape, no matter what you say, collab characters are the only actual true limited characters in terms of not coming back for a long period of time. We still haven't gotten an Espa collab, which, you know, a lot of people maybe do or don't want. And there also are plenty of collabs that haven't returned since their second or maybe third rerun. So in terms of when we'll get certain collabs back, we don't know. So before I deep dive and analyze whether or not her kit and everything in between or involving her is worthwhile, she's a collab character, you must pull for her. But with the more rational side and the more analysis-based side of me that wants to look into her kit and see if she's actually good, she looks like arguably the worst character of the three from the Overlord collab. And unfortunately, even looking through a couple of her numbers, unless if you're going to be, again, playing her in a specific draft or trying to invest in her, it feels like, although I really love her, she's someone that you might want to put on the back burner or see how she performs at first, see if there's a new draft that develops or comes out to kind of complement or highlight or spotlight her. But again, until then, I don't think she's a must pull in that sense in terms of just gameplay performance, but I'm gonna pull her because she's a collab character and I love her. In any case though, guys, I am excited to try her out. Even if I end up losing points, it is what it is. Thank you again though for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's showcase. I hope you enjoyed today's guide about Albedo. If you did, make sure to like, comment, turn on the notification bell, and subscribe. Let me know what you think about these guides. Again, if you're enjoying or really like this kind of format, I'll continue to do this even for the new characters, and you can let me know how you feel about the showcases or what to do for the showcases as well. But yeah, that's going to be it for this video, guys. Thanks again for watching. I will see you on the next one. Good night.